Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining me in Berlin is Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, this week we have one data point that is $21.2 million. That is the GDP of the Vatican city-state. That is an economy directly overseen by the de facto monarch of the Vatican, Pope Francis. But the Pope is not only someone who oversees the Vatican economy, he's also someone who is an intellectual of his own about the economy. Since becoming Pope, he has organized economic conferences, issued theological documents addressing the economy.
This same theater hosted the Holy Father today, along with the over 1,000 young economists, entrepreneurs, and changemakers.
Thousands of young people from 6 continents proposing ways to improve the economy for people at all.
So, on the occasion of Easter, which is upcoming, we thought we would take a closer look at the economic thinking of Pope Francis. So, Adam, first off, I thought we could take a look at the Pope's namesake, Saint Francis, and I wanted to ask what the relationship is between the original Saint Francis and the development of capitalism in general. Is there a connection there, and what could you say about it?
Well, you did some really interesting research on this, Cam. I thought this was fascinating, the stuff you turned up, because Saint Francis was the son, apparently, of a well-heeled merchant and gave that up. The rather evocative phrase in the text that you found said that he gave up the tunic of a well-heeled merchant for a coarse wool of the monastery. But I think, there's at least one story about the development of the market economy in the Middle Ages in Italy that actually credits the Franciscans with really key roles. They apparently set up the first pawn shops in the 1460s, which I'm sure they would have justified as credit systems for poor people in dire straits. Luca Pacioli, who is famous for being the first author to write about the logic of double-entry bookkeeping and really founding modern business accounting, was a Franciscan friar. And so I find this really interesting because what it does is to contradict the theory much beloved in this part of the world, that is Berlin, the kind of Iberian theory, the German theory of the history of capitalism, which roots it in Protestantism several centuries later. And I think it's quite implausible because it's quite obvious, I think, that key elements of the capitalist business logic were being developed in Italy. So it makes far more sense to think of that as tied to the managerial logics of worldly friars, of Catholic and Italian thinkers that were dealing with the very sophisticated city economies of Renaissance Italy. And we're not, because Weber's thesis is it was the Reformation and Calvinism that drove, 50 to 100 to 150 years later, that drove the development of capitalism in the Netherlands, which may be true, but it's not a sufficient explanation, I think, for the breadth and depth of business development all over the continent of Europe in this period.
So Pope Francis, since becoming Pope, has come under criticism from plenty of critics who say that his thinking on the economy is radical. Some even have accused him of being a communist. And yeah, the implicit critique there is that his stance on the economy differs from traditional Catholic approaches to the economy. And I'm curious, what is the position, first of all, of traditional Catholic social theory towards economic development in general? And how does Pope Francis's own thinking differ from that?
Well, I think it's important to be clear because the Catholic Church is such an ancient and venerable institution that when we talk about the tradition of Catholic social teaching, we're talking about something that's only 130 years old, which by the standards of the Catholic Church is very recent, in fact. And it's really with Rerum Novarum, the encyclical of 1891, that the Catholic Church defines its modern, I think one would have to say, rather than traditional approach to the social question. And it does so in the midst of the upheavals of late 19th century modernity against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, and of course the emergence of socialist parties across Europe and much of, say, Latin America as well. And what the Catholic Church does is to found a kind of engagement with modernity that consists in advocating a kind of middle ground. it doesn't deny the significance of markets and private enterprise in driving development, but it insists on moderating and restraining this to meet social needs. And out of that, and to preserve the essential balance which the Catholic Church is interested in, and to ensure that consumerism and capitalist economic growth does not become the be-all and end-all of the lives of the faithful. And out of that comes the relatively broad church, open-minded political economy of Christian democracy around the world, which in a country like Germany, for instance, includes, for much of Europe, in fact, large Catholic trade unions that represent workers' interests in the name of a Catholic social doctrine which moderates the demands of capitalism. So that is the status quo. And the folks you were referring to are, as far as I can see, a bunch of kind of right-wing conservative Catholics who are horrified by Pope Francis, who's a Latin American radical, social radical, who thinks fairly conventional Latin American radical things about this economy, which is that it produces division, it produces inequality, it produces exclusion, and he's against it. And he sees the church standing on the side of the oppressed and of the poor, and he's unafraid to say this and advocate for this position in a way that we haven't seen in the Vatican probably ever. And it's based in some interesting theological shifts in Latin America, which we might say more about in a minute. But I think as a sort of first take, what you'd have to quote is his Evangelii Gaudium from 2013, where he describes the current market system as an economy of exclusion and inequality, and such an economy kills. So I read him as, very much in the kind of mainstream of 2010s post-Piketty kind of radicalism on the need for a rebalancing, or as we've addressed in a recent episode, the talk about a new social contract during COVID. The Pope seems to me to be trying to find a way of talking about the patent illegitimacy and in extreme social conditions produced by the current moment, and thereby becomes embroiled in a global, but really a very strongly transatlantic culture war over this status quo. And it's no secret, I think, that very major battles have been waged within the Catholic hierarchy about how far his radicalism is going to go.
And I mean, just to clarify, is traditional Catholicism capacious enough to include this critique, or is this really represent a doctrinal change, that the things he's kind of saying here within the church itself?
The criticisms of him are not really on theological grounds, but they're more, hey, Pope, shut up, you don't understand anything about economics, which I think he would probably laugh at as a response.
So famously, Francis has delivered an encyclical, theological document on climate change that's referred to as Laudatio Si. I'm curious, on the basis of that document, what we could say about his stance on climate change. I mean, what camp of climate change policy would we say he belongs to? Is he a proponent of degrowth, which is a position that many people take on the left, or is he more a believer in technocratic reform as a potential solution to the problem posed by climate change? I mean, what would you say to that, Adam?
I mean, I think what's striking reading him is, on the one hand, it's quite conventional sounding. I mean, he basically does a kind of growth accounting thing where he'll say that economic growth per se, given the ecological damage it does, cannot really be considered straightforward progress, which is something that's common to many folks thinking about the environment. And he also stresses the way, and this is where I think a kind of rather more distinctive position begins to emerge, where he says that people's quality of life actually diminishes. Deterioration of the environment, the low quality of food, the depletion of resources in the midst of economic growth fundamentally undermines the promise of economic growth. And crucially, then he adds this social justice component, saying what we really need to do is accept decreased growth in some parts of the world in order to provide resources for other places to experience healthy growth. And this, to my mind, is the kind of, the strongly defensible part of the degrowth argument, which is that large parts of the world clearly still do need growth. And to enable that, one would want to downshift in the rich countries, which really need redistribution and quality of life measures more than they need absolute growth. So I'd put him on these grounds in a kind of climate justice camp, really, which is unsurprising given that he comes from, what can fairly be described as the global south. Throughout his writing about the environment, what you see is a sort of focus. You might describe it as a kind of humanism, in the sense that he's interested in economic growth that is well-rounded, that fosters the development of humanity. He refers in rather gendered terms to the development of each man and the whole man, but I think we know what he's going on about, which is, the development of the whole person. And I think that's the center of his thinking. And there's also a very strong emphasis on the refusal of the objectification of those relatively disadvantaged in the global hierarchy. So he talks about everything stems from how one looks and where you look, noting that Jesus's gaze was able to see the gestures of total giving in the poor people who put 2 pennies in the offering box at the temple. So he has this encompassing, there's something about the recognition of the dignity of all people that is quite fundamental to his ecological position. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that his ecological position, from what I've read anyway, seems to start as much as anything from a social assessment, right, of the need to fully account for the full and holistic needs of all people.
That's interesting, because one could imagine how kind of an emphasis on, human dignity could also lead to a kind of argument about human dominion over the planet, right? Sort of, it could cut that in that direction, sort of saying humans are special, therefore we have primacy over the planet. But obviously,
I think it's more that, as it were, it's more kind of line that we're familiar with from, say, Frankfurt School critique, that, as it were, the brutalization of our approach to nature is congruent with the brutalization of our approach to each other, right? So one leads to the other.
Okay, we have to take a quick break here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about the economics of Pope Francis. So I wanted to ask about Francis's relationship to political economic movements around the world. As I mentioned, he's been accused of being an adherent of communism, and that is fanciful, as you kind of pointed out. But what exactly then is his relationship to communism? Yeah, what could we say about that relationship? And moreover, how about libertarianism? As you mentioned, Francis hails from Argentina, and Argentina, as we've discussed on this podcast, has a new president, President Milei, who is a very stark proponent of neoliberal capitalism without constraints. So what is Francis's relationship to that kind of libertarian movement?
I think he's a great distance from it. And thinking about his political development was very interesting because he's a radical priest in 1960s Argentina, so you immediately tend to assume that he comes from the liberation theology wing of Catholicism, which swept across Latin America in the 60s and 70s. And the really interesting thing is that isn't where he comes from, and I think the key to understanding also his environmentalism is that Francis is actually an adherent of what's known in Argentina as the theology of the people. And theology of people is different from liberation theology, because liberation theology implies the leadership, if you like, of a cadre of enlightened priests who will bring the people to liberation, to put it rather crudely and unfairly. Whereas the theology of the people developed in Argentina in the 1960s is something more like populism, in the sense that it starts from an insistence on the people, popular devotion, popular piety, popular spirituality in the face of poverty and oppression as the essential guide for theology and for religious experience. So it isn't that by way of an enlightened left-wing theology you will liberate people so they can make a social revolution. It's rather that you start with the actual practices of poor people's religiosity and anchor your understanding of true religion in a world of consumerism and capitalism and power in the relationship of the poor and the oppressed to God. That's the anchor of your theology. So you'll see the Pope engaged in these very dramatic and I think extremely sincere acts of humility that are about aligning himself with the people as the source of his theology and of his belief. And I mean, his positioning in politics is notoriously complicated, right? Because he's been accused of sins of omission, if you like, in failing to protect left-wing priests within his order during the Argentine dictatorship. There's no doubt, however, that it touched him very closely, and he had many friends and colleagues who were liberation theologians or Marxists who were disappeared by the horrendous Argentinian regime. And he bears the traces of that, so that there is no, I think, possibility of any reconciliation between his understanding of Argentinian politics and the sort of tacit agreement with the periods of dictatorship that you see on the Argentinian right in the present day. And de facto, before he became Pope, he lived in a relatively harmonious relationship with the then Peronist governments in Argentina. So I think it's fair to say that he's a man of the left, but I think it's important to understand what that leftism is rooted in. And it's a kind of workerism. It really is a religiosity of the people that really anchors him, as opposed to a religiosity that's intended to liberate the people. So it was very interesting reading about this theological, and I think this also then deeply shapes his relationship to the church hierarchy.
That's interesting to think of sort of symbolism as its own kind of political force. I mean, liberation would be a more active kind of act than sort of this.
And liberation also implies a relative, it doesn't emphasize the lived and real and existing and actual religiosity and spirituality of the poor right now, not here, not in some future world after the revolution, but right now here. And that, I think, is the fundamental anchor of his faith. It isn't the promise of a better future to be derived by massive political change. Of course, he's interested in that. But for him, the anchor is the existing state.
It's sort of like it's sort of an anti-theory. I mean, it's almost more of a kind of Foucaultian care theory or something, right?
The church is by definition a pastoral institution, of course.
Yeah.
And so at that level, it does involve that paternalistic element. But I think to get the hang of him, one has to, however paradoxical it may seem, imagine a bishop, an archbishop, a pope, who thinks of the ultimate source of religiosity in the modern age, precisely in the modern age when the rest of the world is so corrupted by consumerism and so on, as being the humble and the poor and the disenfranchised. It's a kind of third worldism, quote unquote, of religious politics.
Interesting, yeah. Piety as a
popular piety as a authentic expression of faith in an age in which it's difficult to find such things.
So finally, to shift gears a little bit, I wanted to ask what sort of economic manager Francis has been of the Vatican state itself. As I mentioned, Francis is essentially the monarch of the state, the city-state, to be specific, that the Vatican represents. I mean, are there any ways that his thinking that we've been talking about is directly reflected in the policies he has overseen in the Vatican?
I think so. And I say that. I think so because, my God, Vatican politics policy is complicated. Yeah. And do I grasp this? I am so not sure. This is so beyond my pay grade. I am not sure I really get this. But here's a take. What I understand is that, and it's congruent with what I was just trying to tease out of this, this specific brand of Argentinian theology of the people, which is that I think Francis's big obsession, as far as I understand it, is what's called clericalism. So he apparently gave this address to the Vatican hierarchy where he said, as an old man at heart, I feel that I can tell you about my concern when we fall back into forms of clericalism, when perhaps without noticing we let people believe that we are superior, privileged, on top, and therefore separate from the rest of the holy people of God. And what I think what drives his efforts, and I really don't sure I comprehend what's going on there in Vatican, but what I think is going on there is that he's trying to root out the hierarchical structures that would make the church at its apex, and you can't help talking about it presumably in hierarchical terms, distant from the people that are actually, in his view, the one really authentic kind of radioactive source of actual belief, right? That's where it's actually going on. That's where you get critical mass. It's when you get millions of people who really have very little else to go on but their faith. That's the driver. And so if you've got all this clerical hierarchy in the Vatican playing its complicated games with the bank and the property and the sex scandals and so on, you are far removed from, you're increasingly obsessed within the structure of the church, whereas what you really need to be doing is focusing on this project of dynamizing the church by way of cutting away the levels of hierarchy so as to better access that real source of religious energy. That's my. I'm going with that. This is my version of what's happening there. Maybe if we have readers or listeners who can point us to stuff that we can read that would clarify this for us. But I hope I'm not traducing.
We'd be happy to come for a live show in the Vatican. Maybe we could actually end up talking with any, policymakers there that want to talk with us.
I mean, I know social scientists, a whole bunch of people actually I know who've been consulting with him. He does entertain. Going back to 2013, 2014, when he was first chosen as Pope, because it was the middle of the Eurozone crisis, sweeping much of southern Europe, including Italy, Spain, Greece. And he actually initiated a dialogue with, left social scientists and politicians anchored around Syriza in Greece. And I know several people who've actually been part of those conversations. So it's quite a serious effort on the part of the Vatican, I think, to broaden and widen and incorporate social, political, and economic theory into their current. And that's why then, it makes sense for conservatives within the church and outside to single him out and, make this a real battlefield.
Well, okay. Again, if someone wants to invite us for a live show in the Sistine Chapel or something like that, we would consider it. Anyway, happy Easter, by the way, to those celebrating, and we'll be back next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.